At 08:42 hours on September 10, 1944, 1:31, American heavy bombers appeared over marshalling yards at Ulm, Germany. The bombers released 2,148 tons of high explosives on the rail junction where trains from Munich, Stuttgart, and Austria converged. The bombs destroyed switching equipment, shattered rail lines, demolished locomotive repair facilities, and cratered the yard so extensively that rail traffic could not resume for weeks. Similar attacks occurred simultaneously at Mannheim, Karlsruhe, Mainz, and Koblenz. Within 24 hours, 5 major German rail junctions were non-operational. This was the beginning of the Transportation Plan, Allied strategic bombing's systematic assault on German rail infrastructure. For 3 years, Allied bombers had attacked German cities, factories, and industrial targets with mixed results. German production had actually increased through 1944 despite sustained bombing. Now, Allied planners were trying something different. Instead of destroying production capacity, they would destroy transportation capacity. Factories could build weapons, but if weapons could not be transported to battlefields, building them was pointless. The concept was simple, but had been resisted for years. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commanding RAF Bomber Command, believed in area bombing destroying German cities to break civilian morale. American commanders believed in precision bombing of specific industrial targets, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, synthetic oil refineries. Transportation infrastructure had been discussed as target system, but always deferred in favor of other priorities. The resistance to targeting transportation was partly philosophical. Destroying factories seemed more direct than destroying railways. If aircraft factories were bombed, aircraft production would stop. If railways were bombed, trains would be rerouted and traffic would resume. The logic seemed straightforward, but the logic was wrong. German industry proved remarkably resilient to bombing. Factories were dispersed, rebuilt, moved underground. Production continued despite sustained attacks. But transportation infrastructure could not be dispersed or rebuilt quickly. Railways were fixed geographically. Bridges existed at specific locations. Marshalling yards handled traffic that could not be easily rerouted. The targeting debate intensified in early 1944 as Allied forces prepared for D-Day invasion. Transportation attacks in France were proposed to disrupt German ability to move reinforcements to Normandy. The proposal generated fierce debate. Harris opposed diverting bombers from German cities. American commanders worried that attacking French rail infrastructure would kill French civilians. Churchill personally intervened, concerned that French casualties from Allied bombing would create political problems after liberation. But General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, insisted transportation attacks were essential for D-Day success. He needed German reinforcements delayed. The only way to achieve that was destroying French rail network connecting German forces in France to reinforcements in Germany. Eisenhower won the argument. In March and April 1944, Allied bombers attacked rail targets throughout France and Belgium. By June the 6th, French rail capacity was reduced by approximately 60%. German forces could not move reinforcements quickly to Normandy. The transportation attacks contributed significantly to D-Day's success. After Normandy, attention shifted to Germany itself. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy in August. They were advancing eastward toward German border. Supply lines were extending. Transportation was becoming critical for Allied logistics as well as German logistics. The question was whether to continue attacking German industrial production or to shift focus to German transportation infrastructure. The statistics from France suggested transportation attacks were more effective than industrial attacks. French rail capacity had been reduced 60% in 3 months. German production in France, limited as it was, had been largely immobilized. Weapons could not reach German forces. Supplies could not reach forward units. The transportation paralysis affected German combat capability more than the destruction of any particular factory. German transportation in 1944 was almost entirely dependent on railways. Germany had approximately 34,000 miles of rail lines, 23,000 locomotives, and 900,000 freight cars. The system moved approximately 20 million tons of freight monthly in 1943: coal, steel, weapons, supplies, everything that sustained German industry and military. Highways were secondary. Most German freight moved by rail because railways were more efficient for heavy cargo over long distances. The rail system had choke points, major marshalling yards where trains were sorted and redirected, bridge crossings over major rivers: the Rhine, Danube, Main, Elbe, Oder, locomotive repair facilities where engines were maintained. If these choke points were destroyed, rail traffic would be disrupted throughout the system. Unlike factories that could be dispersed, rail infrastructure was geographically fixed and had limited redundancy. Allied planners identified approximately 100 critical rail targets in Germany. Major marshalling yards at cities like Munich, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Cologne, Hanover, Berlin, bridge crossings over the Rhine and other rivers, locomotive works at Kassel, Munich, and Vienna. Destroying these targets would fragment German rail network into disconnected segments unable to handle long-distance freight traffic efficiently. The transportation plan for Germany began in September 1944. The attacks were systematic and sustained. Unlike earlier bombing campaigns that concentrated on single target categories, the transportation plan attacked multiple target types simultaneously. Marshalling yards were bombed to prevent train sorting. Bridges were bombed to prevent trains crossing rivers. Locomotives were bombed at repair facilities. Rail lines were bombed at critical junctions. The cumulative effect was paralysis of entire system. The results were immediate and measurable. German rail traffic in September 1944 averaged approximately 900,000 freight car movements daily. By December 1944, traffic had declined to 700,000 movements daily. By February 1945, traffic was 550,000 movements daily. By March 1945, traffic was 200,000 movements daily, less than 25% of September levels. The system was collapsing. The collapse affected everything. Coal could not move from Ruhr mines to power stations. Steel could not move from factories to manufacturers. Weapons could not move from production facilities to front lines. Food could not reach cities. Civilians could not evacuate from bombed areas. Military units could not deploy or redeploy. The transportation paralysis created cascading failures throughout German economy and military. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, later testified that transportation attacks were more devastating than any other form of strategic bombing. Speer had managed to sustain production through years of attacks on cities and factories. He dispersed industry, moved facilities underground, substituted materials, recruited forced labor, streamlined processes. German production actually peaked in 1944 despite 3 years of sustained bombing. But Speer could not substitute for destroyed transportation. When trains stopped moving, production became irrelevant. Speer's ministry documented the collapse in detail. Monthly reports tracked rail capacity, freight tonnage moved, production affected by transportation shortages. The reports showed systematic degradation. In October 1944, steel plants in the Ruhr reported they could not ship finished steel because rail capacity was insufficient. In November, tank factories reported they lacked components because supplier factories could not ship parts. In December, ammunition plants reported they lacked raw materials because supply trains were not arriving. By January 1945, the situation was catastrophic. German industry was producing weapons at rates approaching 1944 levels. Tank production was 80% of peak, aircraft production was 70% of peak, but the weapons sat at factories unable to reach the front. German units in combat zones were running out of ammunition, fuel, spare parts, not because production had stopped, but because transportation had stopped. The Wehrmacht was being starved logistically while German factories continued producing. The Ruhr industrial region, Germany's manufacturing heartland, was isolated by March 1945. Every bridge over the Rhine River west of the Ruhr had been destroyed by bombing. The rail yards at Duisburg, Essen, and Dortmund were non-operational. Coal from Ruhr mines could not reach factories outside the Ruhr. Steel from Ruhr mills could not be shipped east. the entire region, which produced 60% of German steel and 50% of German coal, was cut off from the rest of Germany. The isolation created absurd situations. Factories in the Ruhr continued producing steel because they had coal from local mines and ore from stockpiles, but the steel could not be transported. It accumulated in storage yards. Meanwhile, tank factories in central Germany lacked steel and were reducing production. The steel existed. The factories needed it. But transportation infrastructure was so damaged that moving steel from the Ruhr to central Germany was impossible. Speer reported to Hitler in mid-March that Germany's war economy had 4 to 6 weeks of functionality remaining. Transportation collapse was making continued production futile. Factories could operate, but their output was stranded. Military units could fight, but they would soon run out of supplies. The war was being lost through logistical paralysis rather than military defeat or industrial destruction. The effectiveness of transportation attacks compared to earlier bombing strategies was stark. 3 years of city bombing had killed approximately 400,000 German civilians, destroyed 3.6 million homes, and devastated dozens of cities. German production increased throughout this period. Morale remained adequate. The civilian toll was enormous, but strategic impact was minimal. Factories were rebuilt, workers were replaced, production continued. Precision bombing of industrial targets had mixed results. Attacks on ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt in 1943 caused heavy bomber losses and achieved limited production effects. Germany substituted simpler bearings, imported from Sweden, and recovered production within months. Attacks on aircraft factories were partially successful. German aircraft production peaked in 1944, but might have been higher without bombing. But attacks on synthetic oil plants in 1944 were highly successful. Fuel shortages crippled German military operations by late 1944. Transportation attacks were more effective than any previous strategy except oil attacks. The difference was that transportation infrastructure could not be substituted, dispersed, or rebuilt quickly. Railways required fixed infrastructure tracks, bridges, switching equipment, locomotives. Destroying this infrastructure created permanent degradation until it was repaired, and repairs took weeks or months, during which transportation capacity was reduced. The bridge attacks were particularly effective. Bridges were precision targets, narrow structures requiring accurate bombing. But once destroyed, bridges could not be quickly rebuilt. German engineers could repair damaged rail yards in days or weeks. Repairing a destroyed bridge over the Rhine required months. Without Rhine bridges, rail traffic between western and eastern Germany was severely restricted. The remaining bridges became choke points, which Allied bombers attacked repeatedly. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen became famous when American forces captured it intact in March 1945. The capture allowed American troops to cross Rhine before German engineers could destroy the bridge, but the capture also revealed why bridges were so critical. The Remagen Bridge was one of the last intact Rhine crossings. Its capture gave Americans immediate access to eastern Germany. If the bridge had been destroyed earlier by bombing, German forces west of the Rhine would have been isolated and more easily defeated. Locomotive attacks complemented marshalling yard and bridge attacks. Germany needed locomotives to move trains. Destroying locomotives reduced rail capacity even if tracks and yards were intact. Allied fighters and bombers strafed and bombed locomotives throughout Germany. By early 1945, Germany had lost approximately 40% of its locomotive fleet to Allied attacks. The surviving locomotives were overworked, poorly maintained, and frequently breaking down. The locomotive shortage created bottlenecks. Trains sat idle, waiting for locomotives. Freight accumulated at yards without engines to move it. German locomotive production was approximately 1,000 units per year, insufficient to replace losses of 5,000 to 6,000 locomotives annually. The locomotive fleet was depleting steadily. By April 1945, Germany had perhaps 12,000 operational locomotives compared to 23,000 in 1943. The shortage made transportation collapse worse. The German military attempted countermeasures. They prioritized military traffic over civilian traffic. They reserved remaining rail capacity for ammunition, fuel, and essential military supplies. They deployed anti-aircraft guns around critical rail facilities. They built temporary bridges to bypass destroyed crossings. They repaired damaged rail yards as quickly as possible. But the countermeasures were insufficient against sustained Allied bombing. The repair efforts faced overwhelming challenges. German repair crews could fix damaged rail yards, but Allied bombers would return within days and bomb them again. The attacks were relentless. As soon as a marshalling yard resumed operations, it was bombed again. The cycle of damage and repair prevented sustained restoration of rail capacity. German logistics operated in constant state of emergency, with transportation capacity declining despite continuous repair efforts. The impact on German civilians was severe. Food distribution depended on rail transport. Coal for heating homes required rail transport. Evacuation from bombed cities required rail transport. As rail capacity declined, civilian suffering increased. Food shortages worsened. Coal shortages meant cold homes in winter. Civilians trapped in bombed cities could not evacuate because trains were unavailable. The transportation collapse affected civilians as severely as it affected military operations. The strategic lesson from transportation bombing was that attacking economic systems required identifying critical nodes rather than attempting to destroy all capacity. German industry was dispersed across hundreds of facilities. Attacking every factory individually was inefficient and allowed Germany to disperse and rebuild. But transportation infrastructure had limited redundancy. Destroying key rail yards, bridges, and repair facilities created systemic failures that affected all industries simultaneously. The timing of transportation attacks was also important. Early in the war, Germany had excess transportation capacity. Attacking railways in 1941 or 1942 would have inconvenienced Germany but not paralyzed it. By 1944, Germany was operating near maximum rail capacity. Military requirements, industrial freight, and civilian needs were consuming all available capacity. Destroying even small percentages of capacity created major disruptions. The transportation plan succeeded in 1944-1945, partly because German transportation system was already stressed to limits. Post-war analysis concluded that sustained transportation attacks beginning in late 1943 or early 1944 would have collapsed German industry earlier and potentially shortened the war by months. But Allied commanders in 1943 were focused on other priority cities, factories, oil. The transportation plan was implemented only after other strategies had proven less effective than hoped. The delay cost additional months of war and additional casualties. The effectiveness of transportation bombing influenced post-war military doctrine. Attacking enemy logistics and infrastructure became standard strategy in subsequent conflicts. Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War all featured systematic attacks on transportation systems. The lesson from World War II was that denying enemy ability to move forces and supplies was more effective than attempting to destroy all enemy forces directly. But transportation bombing also raised moral questions. Attacking rail yards and bridges killed civilians. German rail workers repairing damaged infrastructure were killed by bombs. Trains carrying civilians were attacked. Refugees using railways to evacuate were caught in bombing raids. The civilian casualties from transportation attacks were substantial, though less than from city bombing. The strategic effectiveness partially justified the civilian cost, but the moral questions remained unresolved. The transportation plan succeeded where other strategies had not because it identified the target system that Germany could not do without and could not quickly replace. Factories could be rebuilt, workers could be replaced, but transportation infrastructure was geographically fixed, required specific engineering, and took months to repair after destruction. Once Allied bombers achieved systematic destruction of German rail network, German industry became irrelevant. Factories could produce, but if products could not move, production served no purpose. By April 1945, German rail traffic was below 200,000 car movements daily, less than 25% of September 1944 levels. German industrial production had not collapsed. Many factories continued operating. But the products sat immobile. Tanks completed at factories could not reach battlefields. Ammunition produced at plants could not reach artillery units. The German military was starving logistically despite German industry still producing. The disconnect between production and delivery was absolute. When Germany surrendered May 7, 1945, German transportation infrastructure was comprehensively destroyed. Approximately 70% of major rail bridges were inoperative. Most major marshalling yards were extensively damaged. The locomotive fleet was reduced by 50% from 1943 levels. Reconstruction of German rail system took years after the war. The damage was so extensive that some rail lines were never rebuilt, being permanently abandoned. The transportation plan's success validated what some strategists had argued since 1942, that attacking economic infrastructure was more effective than attacking industrial production. But the validation came late. 3 years of strategic bombing had focused on cities and factories with limited success. 6 months of transportation attacks collapsed German logistics completely. The lesson was learned expensively, through years of ineffective bombing and hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties from strategies that did not accomplish their objectives. The irony was that the solution had been available from the beginning. German dependence on rail transport was known in 1940. The vulnerability of rail infrastructure to bombing was obvious, but Allied commanders chose other target cities because they were large and easy to hit, factories because they seemed to be the source of German power, oil because it was critical resource. Transportation was neglected until other strategies had been exhausted. When transportation was finally targeted systematically, it worked. This was the story of bombing Germany's transportation network, the belated recognition that German industry depended on ability to move production from factories to battlefields. The September 1944 decision to target transportation systematically. The 6-month campaign that reduced German rail capacity by 75%. The logistical paralysis that made German industrial production irrelevant. And the realization, achieved too late to shorten the war significantly, that destroying the ability to move anything anywhere was more effective than destroying the ability to produce anything at all. The transportation plan succeeded where 3 years of city and factory bombing had not, by targeting the system that could not be quickly replaced and that all industry depended upon. The trains stopped running. German industry kept producing, but nothing moved, and that made all the difference.